Great. All right. So, hello and welcome to the Nevada Art Council webinar on how to photograph your artwork on any budget and skill level. My name is Sapira Chirk. I am the Artist Service Specialist, and I am joined by my colleague Stephen Reed and artist Andrew Thompson. We begin this webinar by acknowledging that we gathered here today from the ancestral homelands of the Numa, the Niue, the Nuuvi, and the Washishu, who have lived in the Great Basin since time began. Please join me in expressing our deepest respect and gratitude to our four major indigenous groups: the Northern Paiute, the Shoshone, the Southern Paiute, and the Washoe. Not just the original caretaker of the land we now call Nevada, but for their enduring stewardship and protection of our shared lands and waterways. Today, the Nevada Art Council reaffirms its commitment to improve the quality of life for our 27 tribal nations, bands, colony, and the 62,000 plus urban Indians who've chosen to make Nevada their current home. So again, welcome. Hosting our webinar today is Andrew Thompson. A little bit about Andrew. Andrew K. Thompson is an artist and educator working in Southern California. He holds an MFA in studio art and design from California State University, San Bernardino, a certificate degree in art business from New York University, and a BFA in photography from the Academy of Art in San Francisco. He has exhibited throughout the United States, including the California Museum of Photography, the Center for Fine Art Photography, Lancaster Museum of Art and History, the Riverside Art Museum, the Ontario Airport Stratehaga Gallery at the Descanso Gardens, Cults Gallery NYC, Gallery 1 of 1, and the SRO Photo Gallery at Texas Tech University. Thompson co-founded the Little Gallery of San Bernardino, an artist-run space dedicated to regional artists of the Inland Empire. Musings on his work have appeared in LA Weekly, KVC Arts, Artillery Magazine, KCET Artbound, and the Photo Exchange. So again, thank you for coming. If you have any questions throughout this webinar, you can either use the Q&A function, you can chat it into the chat, or use the raise hand function, and I'll be assisting in monitoring all that stuff. And as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel if you need to refer to it again. We'll also be sharing some PDF downloadable that you can take with you when you need to revisit all this material. So stay tuned and we'll have all that for you on our website and our social media. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrew.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Sapira. Thank you, Stefan, and everybody at the Nevada Arts Council. I really appreciate the invitation to give this presentation. This is a skill set that I somehow bumped into. It definitely stems out of my commercial training at the Academy of Art of San Francisco. But as somebody who always wanted to be an artist, I was always around artists, and a lot of artists need photographs of their artwork. So I hope that I can present some helpful information for those who know very little about photography. And for those who know something about photography, this can be fairly simple because you just take a few basic tenets of photography and kind of work from there. So the first thing I'm going to say, this is kind of in jest, but also a little bit serious. If you can afford it, pay somebody. I know that not everybody can, but it does relieve stress. It takes stress off your shoulders to do other things. This is one of the reasons why Catherine Gray from Blown Away has been hiring me to photograph her work, and many other glass artists that are not, as well known as Catherine, have been hiring me specifically because glass is quite difficult to photograph. That's a whole nother conversation I'll have at a later date if anybody asks. But this isn't for those who can afford it. This is for those who can't afford it. So the first thing that I would suggest anybody who's really serious about this is to make let me go back, make a small investment into gu- Okay, we're back. So I was talking about the Tiffin color separation guide in grayscale. The reason why is that our eyes are we have, each person has different color blindness. If you're not colorblind, perception's quite, it's on a spectrum. So the thing about a color guide like this is that you have your whites, you have your neutrals, you have your blacks. And if you were getting into digital printing, you would know that you'd have to actually color check by the numbers. Like 256 is a clear white in the RGB scale, and 0 in the CMYK. And I don't want to get into that because it's really quite overwhelming once you get into like color separation and all this stuff. So, okay, so you want to use either that white or the neutral gray. We'll get into the reasons why in a little bit, and you don't have to use this, but it's definitely a very helpful tool, and I'll explain why as we go along. So the Tiffin color guide, everybody. Another conversation, this is if you have your own camera. So let's say you have a DSLR. We haven't gotten into cell phones yet. So if you have your own camera, first, check your white balance and be sure that it's set to the appropriate settings for your lighting conditions. Warm light required, for instance, overhead lights in your house often have a Kelvin balance of 2,500 to 3,000. Fluorescent lights have a greenish hue to them at 4,000 to 5,000 Kelvin, and flash and natural light tend to be about 5,000 to about 6,000 to 7,000 Kelvin. So you want to, without getting too deep into the Kelvin scale and the color temperature, take a look at your icons here, and we're going to talk later in this about shade, open shade. So you may want to consider this icon, the building with the lines to the side, because this is what's open shade. I'll talk about this a little bit more in the near future. But it would be helpful for you to understand what color tint your light is casting. If you're not sure, that again, this is why it's good to have that color Tiffin bar, because you can just click on that neutral gray, and guess what? It's neutral gray. And a program like Lightroom can, or Photoshop, Photopea, even Snapseed, all of these we'll kind of briefly talk about. Any one of those, you can click on that neutral gray and you'll have a even color temperature. So the one thing to be very careful of is not to use multiple different casts of light. So you will have a very difficult time if one light is fluorescent and the other light is halogen or domestic lighting. You're really going to get into troubles there. So you want to at least be confident that your all your lights are casting a similar Kelvin temperature range, because again, color correction is going to become a very important part of this. And if you're unsure, use an auto white balance. That's a safe choice if you're not sure, especially if you have a DSLR or a mirrorless camera. Also, if you have your own camera, shoot RAW files. If you're not familiar with RAW files, they are full uncompressed files that contain every bit of information a camera can provide, where a JPEG compresses and tosses out a lot of details. So for an example, I like to use this. Imagine a clear water bottle filled with water. You can feel the weight when you hold it in your hands, and that's a RAW file. It contains everything. including the water inside, which is clear. Now, once you've drank that bottle of water, that bottle still looks the same as if it were filled with water, but now it's lighter. That's a JPEG. It's thrown out a lot of the details so that it can be compressed. So imagine I'm going to crush that bottle. I'm going to throw it to you over the internet, and then your email server will uncrush that bottle, and you'll have that clear bottle again. So you don't want to deal with compressed files if you can control it. When we get to cell phones, some cell phones will allow you to shoot raw files. If you can, it's always going to be in your best interest to shoot raw files because you will have the complete data. And if you need any more information, feel free to click this link. These PDF slides will be available to you as well. So shoot raw files if and when you can. Now, this is hyper important. I teach a lot of photo classes, a lot of beginning classes, and the ISO might be one of the misunderstood / confused and often abused aspects of the exposure triangle. The ISO used to be I'd like to say a anchored point with film. If I reach over and I grab 2 of these rolls of film, this one says 400, right? So that's the ISO 400. ISO means that it's how sensitive your film or digital sensor or chip is to light, how sensitive it is to light. Meaning a lower ISO takes more time to get the same exposure as a higher ISO. The trade-off, though, is always grain. And if you're a film photographer, you may have fallen in love with your T-Max 3200 grain, chef's kiss, like that's part of the look. Digital, not so pretty. When you see, let's see, get this bottom right corner, the ISO is 25,600. You see all those bits, it's green and kind of magenta, and it looks like the picture is bruised. Like it's some sort of fruit that's aging. This is going to be the result of a high ISO. And often beginners will either have their camera set to auto ISO, which can cause problems if you end up in these giant high elevated ISOs, or they use the ISO as a kind of cheat to fudge your exposure to a shutter speed that will not cause motion blur. We will have to do some of this when we talk about performance and theater performance art, play with the ISO a bit. But when you are shooting still, something that's not moving, do yourself a favor, shoot at the lowest ISO possible, 100, 400, 200, even 50 if you have it. Because as you can see on the upper left corner, see how smooth that picture is, that detail? No grain. That's what you want, because ultimately, when you're photographing a piece of art, whether it's yours or somebody else's, you don't want anyone to see the photograph of the art. You want everyone to see the art, right? So you kind of want to be, as a photographer, you want to become invisible so that the artwork can be highlighted. And if you have a grain like this 25,600, you can see that all that grain, that bidding, becomes like a screen that really acknowledges that this is a photograph of a thing versus look at this thing. So when you can, always lower ISO, especially if it's a non-moving object. That's the ideal. I'll get into the asterisks later when we get into performing and performance art, theater and performance art. Excuse me. One last thing, or maybe it's not the last thing, but another thing, if you have your own camera It's ideal if you use a 50 millimeter prime lens. This is for 35 millimeter. It's 80 for medium format, and I believe 105 for like a 4x5 camera. I could be wrong on that, so don't quote me. But the point that we're trying to get to with 35 millimeter, a 50 millimeter lens will provide less distortion. Just to say this correctly, 55 millimeter lens for a 35 millimeter DSLR, assuming that you're shooting digitally. You can see here these two versions of distortion, either barreled, really kind of bulged out. This often happens with a wider lens. Think like a fisheye lens, and why those things are like really bugged out to you, because the width of the fisheye lens creates this barrel distortion. Pin cushion too, when you kind of falls in. Now, if you have a zoom lens, some of this could cause, like, let's say you zoom in all the way, it could cause this pin cushion distortion. If you widen out all the way, it can cause the barrel. So if you have a zoom lens, do your best to get it to about 50 millimeters. And I've experienced it where it helps if you have your camera pointing straight down. There are some devices that will put your lights at 45-degree angle. They're called a copy stand. And you have your flat ground, and then you have your camera like on a tripod shooting straight down. If you have a zoom lens, sometimes the weight of the gravity will pull that lens down, distorting your picture. So if you can, at best, ideally use a 50 millimeter lens, preferably prime, for your 35 millimeter DSLR or full frame camera to avoid distortion. If you have your own lights, it would behoove you, it'd be easier for your goal to use strobes, flash, or speed lights, because they are more powerful, which means you can use a lower ISO, which allows for more flexibility, meaning a wider range in f-stop. And the color temperatures are already balanced at 5500 Kelvin. So this is a lot, is very convenient, but I know that not a lot of people have this type of equipment. Strobes, flash, speed lights would be like the flash, on-camera flash that you put, slide to the top of your camera. Of course, you would need two of those, and I'll tell you why in a second, and possibly three. So not a lot of people have access to these tools, but if you did, it would make your goals happen easier. Projects are easier when you have the correct tools. So that's just the way it is. Now, not everybody has that. So most people are going to have what are called continuous lights. This is the LEDs, tungstens, house light bulbs. They work too. They're not as powerful, which means that you'll probably need a higher ISO. You'll probably have to work in wider f-stops, and you wouldn't be able to get like something like a real small f-stop to get like really tight focus. And they could vary in color temperature. One other thing that's not listed here is that because they are not as powerful, you may need to have a tripod, because even if your object isn't but it isn't moving, you are, right? I'm going to mention this again, but don't shoot anything lower than 1/60th of a second. You may be able to fudge at 1/45th of a second, but once you get into 1/30th of a second, just a breath is going to give just like a slight motion blur, just like a little bit of a blur. So the kind of like the drop deadline is 1/60th of a second for a sharp picture. So with continuous lights, you may need a tripod. You may need higher ISOs. You may not be able to get a really small aperture to get a really tight focus. And they could have different coloring temperatures. They could vary in color temperature. All of this, especially the varied color temperature, is crucial. You will create a knot that's hard to untie if you have 2 or 3 different color temperature light bulbs. So for instance, there are some, let's say you get on Amazon, you get one of those tents. Excellent device, right? You know, the bigger your object, the bigger you need a tent though. And you may get one of those tents, you may get one of those lights that have like an LED bulb. Those are great. But make sure that they're all the same bulb. And if you really want to get nitpicky, buy them all at the same time, because as the bulbs age, you know, the cast becomes different. So that's most likely going to be within reach. Buying an LED panel. I mean, when I say buying, I mean 2, because for 2-dimensional work, you're going to need at least 2 lights. I'll get into this in just a minute. For 3-dimensional work, you might want to use 3 lights. You can probably get away with 2 lights if you're in one of these tents that you can buy. But I'll expand on why 3 lights would be a better minimum when photographing 3-dimensional work. So to wrap up this slide, when using continuous lights, it is crucial to be sure that each light is the same color temperature. Mixed color temperatures will make it nearly impossible to get a clean, even white balance for your artwork. Will have an unusual tint. I will move on. So 2D artwork might be the easiest. I'll put that in quotation marks. When I worked for Martin Lawrence Gallery, I might have been able to go through close to 80 aqua tints of Salvador Dali and or Picasso or Andy Warhol, because they're 2-dimensional. That particular space had this wonderful backdrop that instead of framing or and hanging your artwork, you had like a imagine a air hockey table that worked in reverse. So instead of sending air up so you can play air hockey, it sucked air back. So I'd be able to put up a flat piece of work stuck to that piece of that backing, and then I never had to change my lights because you want 45-degree angles. I'll expand on that in a minute. And with my camera, all I'd have to do is move it closer or further away depending on the size of the 2-dimensional work. So it's really quite simple in the sense that you want 2 lights pointing at 45 degrees, and you want to make sure that all 5 points of a, hold on, I'm going to get a phone call. I don't want it to interrupt the computer. So 45-degree lights, because you have 5 points. So 5 points, corner, 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 center. You want all that to be even. So if you have one light coming this way, this is going to be bright and it's going to fall off. So you have the other light here, that's going to be bright and it's going to fall off. And if you really want to be picky and specific, you would get yourself a light meter and take a light reading at all 5 points. And if you have the lights angled correctly, all 5 points would be within, you know, 1/3 of a stop. So this is, in a way, a really simple, easy, convenient way to photograph artwork. It does get tricky when your artwork's really huge. let's say you're photographing a Vic Munez print that's 8 feet tall, you've got to get back really far away. One light, pardon me, one light each on either side might not cast enough. So like, let's say these top corners are well lit and even, but your bottom ones have shadow. So now you got to get 4 lights, 2 on either side. You got to get farther away. And you still have to somehow get that 2-dimensional work to lie flat, because you don't want it to angle away from you. Pardon me, it'd be something like this, because then you're going to get distortion. I'll show you how to fix distortion in a Photoshop setting, but it is always ideal to do it right the first time, you know, because this can cause headaches later in the post-production if your artwork is tilting back. So strategies for photographing 2-dimensional art. If it's, let's say, 8 by 10 to 20 by 24, maybe even 30 by 36 or something, and you can and you have a wall space to hang it, then you're in good shape. If you have a copy stand, or if you like make a copy stand, copy stand is really just having a camera instead of on a tripod pointing this way, you have the pointing down. And so you can get a tripod, you can lean it on a table, put some weights on it so that your camera points directly down, and then you can shoot on the floor. I've even climbed ladders and had to, you know, suspend the cameras across 2 ladders so I can shoot down on a very large object. So that's where it gets tricky, is on the scale. But in terms of photographing it, it's really simple. 45-degree lights that way. Now, another thing to consider is that you don't want your lights like offset. So again, if you're being really specific and picky, I sometimes would get a tape measure and measure that the center of the lights are at the same height. And I would also measure from the artwork the distance to the light on either side, so one's not closer than the other, you know, and you want each as even as possible. And if you can control those things, all the better. If you can't, I've got strategies. We'll talk about that in the near future. So just to kind of wrap up this slide, you want your camera centered and squared. So another example, let's say I'm photographing, I'll use this book as a photograph, right? You want the camera square, not off, not angled, not tilting. You know, any sort of distortion will cause your life trouble in the post-production, cause more time, a little bit more headaches, and you have to get into a deeper bag of tricks. So do yourself a favor, be square and center with your camera. 45-degree lights, also even as possible in distance and height. Take, you know, care to make sure that these points, the 5 points, are even as best you can. You may not have a light meter, but if you do, that's a good way to do it. And try not to have your light sources closer one than the other. And one last thing that I didn't mention, and it's not on this slide. Let's say you are photographing that has a very shiny surface. Let's say you have a painting that has some matte acrylic paint and then some really glossy acrylic paint. You know, it's a variety of textures, right? You may, in something like a very shiny situation, it would also be helpful to put what are they called, neutral density filters over your lights. So a neutral density filter, usually you see them like as a lens that you screw on. but you can also buy like a plastic square that you can tape over your lights, and that also helps cut down reflection. The drawback is, and this is like an exact example. I'm photographing an artist named Renee Lalonde, and Renee likes to make paintings that have this nice acrylic but matte colors that are contrasted by like gold leaf paint or silver leaf paint. I have to put on my neutral density filters on the light and on the lens so that the surface doesn't glare, but then that gold leaf paint needs to glare, right? Otherwise you just squashed the color, the presence of it. So in that situation, I would have to photograph it fully with full neutral density filters on lights, on camera, and without moving the camera, without moving the object, unscrew that light and then photograph it without the neutral density filter on the camera. And then that way the gold shines, it glimmers, right? And then I would have to go into Photoshop, overlay the two, and cut out the gold pieces, flatten it, and now you have a picture of the artwork that looks like the artwork. So that's one other thing I want to say about 2D work. Three-dimensional.
Sorry, Andrew,
Go ahead.
just really quick, I just want to interject. Are there any questions? Andrew's giving a lot of information, so if there's any questions, I don't see any hands.
I saw some chats, but what camera would you recommend? I'm going to tell you that the best camera is the one that's in your hand. If you have not purchased a DSLR or a what are they called, mirrorless cameras, it's I mean, it depends on your budget, because there's always going to be someone with a better camera. I have been in rooms where people talk about their wonderful Canon 5D, yada yada, this and that, and I'm like, great, I use a Leaf P20, which is, you know, $100,000 camera. So I would worry less about the camera, focus more on your budget. Now, let's say you have a starter or a beginner budget, right? Maybe you want to get a Canon T7, one of those, what I call prosumer cameras. These are cameras that are mostly geared towards high-end hobbyists / consumers, but have many of the professional tools, but not all. So for instance, a professional camera will have in the past, before a lot of Bluetooth and Wi-Fi controllers for strobes that you can just plug onto your camera, every professional camera would have what's called a PC unit, which you'd plug your flash strobes into, and that would connect to your strobes. They still make them. Professional cameras still have that, but many people these days will have a like a Wi-Fi or Bluetooth adapter that slides onto their hot shoe, and then that will fire off their strobes, so that you don't have to be tethered. I know I'm just getting into the weeds on this, but what camera would I suggest is like almost a too broad of a question. It really comes down to your budget. Do you have any follow-up, Vanessa? I'll pick up questions later. So I'm just going to jump back into 3D. 3D is certainly going to be the most difficult. 3D is, you might as well be a photographer in this sense, because it can be tricky. Things that make it super easy are those tents, you know, those small tents that you get from Amazon or from a photo store that have like a white is not a sheet, but it's like a reflector diffuser type of material. That would make it easier for you, because then the diffuser does everything. You just kind of drop lights on top of those diffusers and it kind of evens things out. The trick with those is that you may buy a big one and only make small work, and then you have this big old thing in your room and kind of taking up your space. Don't use it that often. Maybe you think, oh, I'm going to save some money, and you get a small one, and then you start making bigger work and it doesn't fit. You don't have the space to kind of crop out or remove anything. So that's always a trick. If you are handy, you can potentially get some PVC pipings, build a little PVC pipe, buy a white sheet, preferably flat sheet. I mean, it's a little bit easier to work with. And then stretch that, get some A clamps, and then stretch the sheet really tight over that tubing frame, and then you can use that as a diffuser. That will be another way to get something like those tents on a really, really tight budget. But everything, everything gets more complicated once you're in 3D. But I do have some advice and some strategies for those who are really bare bones on their budget, and we'll get to that in a little bit. So I'm still assuming you may have lights. I'm still assuming you may have a camera. So 3D first, use a seamless background. Number one, use a seamless background, because you wouldn't want, let's say you're photographing this wonderful brass sculpture. You don't want to see the trash can in your kitchen in the back, because, I'm saying I want to just see the sculpture. Again, the idea is to not see the photograph of the object, but to only focus on the object, only see the sculpture. A seamless background will help you. I do a lot of white seamless backgrounds, but it doesn't have to be white. I don't know if they're published, but I did some work for Catherine where we chose this nice kind of Easter egg yellow background. She has some like porcelain, green porcelain objects that were things that she collected, not her artwork. And then we also used like this kind of lightly saturated pink. In the past, I recently photographed for another glass artist named Adam Cohen, and he wanted his work on black background. And it made sense because his work is this really vibrant, almost glow in the dark artwork. And we don't want the white to distract that. We want that black so that artwork really saturates, really kind of stands up or stands off, or photographers like to say pop off that background. Whatever you choose, let it emphasize the artwork, not take away from the artwork. But seamless background is definitely going to be your best bet. The other thing is, I personally suggest a 3 light minimum, and we can even go further than that. I've gotten up to 5, 6 sometimes, depending on the object. But 3 light has your top, and in this scenario, your right are your key lights. Key lights meaning they are your main light, the main light source. They're going to be the strongest lights. And the top would be to provide this kind of overhead light right here. And the right light will, as you can see how my face is shaped just by the window that I'm sitting next to, I have this highlight right here, and this is my shadow. So you would have, and if I turned on the light ahead of me, above me, you would get that kind of view that I'm looking at, so that you have highlight up here, highlight right here, slight shadow right here. The third light is what I call a directional light. And this is once, when I'm shooting with strobes, I can control the stop variation. And it's usually one stop lower, maybe two. But that is to provide edge or direction. So if you can see right here, the back of my head where my right hand is, in my earphones, there's not a lot of separation between that and the background, the black bookshelf that's behind me. But if I had, see if I can like do this on the fly. If I put like a little bit of light behind me, you can't quite see it. Of course you can see this part, but you can see how there's a little bit of separation from the background. And that's what we're trying to do with this third light. You're giving a little bit of edge so that there's a definitive 3D, third dimension. So you give a little bit of an edge, and you also push a what I call a drop shadow, a directional drop shadow that pushes a little bit forward. Because if you would look at the full 3D object, there will be a drop shadow directly below the object, which is from the light above. The key light to the right is going to cast a shadow backwards outside of the picture frame. So the directional light is going to give separation to the back and also have a little bit of a forward drop shadow. All of this helps create this 3D appearance in a 2D frame. Let's say you don't have strobes and you can't control the drop shadow, right? Or you can't control the stop level. Another trick, you have your key lights close to the object, and then you have your directional light farther away from the object. If you just try to remember that light falls off. So, as I get close to this window, you can see how intense it is here. When I come over here, you see how much less intense it is. So that's a light fall off. So if for whatever reason, if you have strobes and you can't turn them down enough, pull it back. If you don't have strobes and you can't control the power level, you can still pull it back, because that's a simple way to control the intensity of a light. So by creating this difference in intensity, light intensity, it helps shape the object more. So back to those tents. If you did one of those tents, but you can still, a lot of people will just put them all on top of one another really close up, and it looks nice, but it also has this almost flat, because it's like, especially if you have two lights on either side and a top. But even if you use a tent, you can pull those lights away from the tent, put two on top really close, one maybe a foot away, and that will drop the intensity. So let me just read some of this. The directional light is slightly behind the object and with a slight angle towards the camera. You don't want it directly at the camera, but towards the camera a little bit. And this will allow the top and right sides to be brighter than the left. And the left side of the object will have a faint shadow, but there will be a definition on the back of the object. And the directional light will also provide this slight drop shadow in the front. I'm going to go a little bit off to a sidebar, but ask yourself, next time you go to a restaurant with pictures in their menu, take note where the shadow lands. Because if it's appetizing, most likely the shadow is directly below the food or slightly in front towards the viewer. If it looks funky, like, oh, I don't want to eat that, it's usually because the light is being pushed back. The shadows behind the object and the intense light is right in front, as if somebody just did a snapshot without, adjusting the lights in any way. It's something that you may not notice until you start looking for it, but But be on the lookout, because this like drop shadow, the slightly forward or directly below, really helps shape the object and really creates this dimension within the flat frame of a camera. Okay, moving along. So let's say you don't have lights. Let's say you are fully tight budget. I don't have lights. I've got no idea how to use this stuff. I don't have the time to learn it. I'm not even interested. So cool. We got that. So the key term is open shadow or open shade. I tend to say shadow a lot, but you'll find on the internet it's mostly called open shade. An open shade is anywhere that is shaded from direct sunlight, but still has ambient light around it. In other words, you don't want to be in the deep, dark shaded area. You need to have light around it so that the area is quote unquote open to light. Hard light is direct sunlight. It's very strong. It's very harsh. And as you can see by these two examples, the hard light, you can see just how bright that highlight is on this child's forehead and nose. It's almost like a reverse Rembrandt, right? Like instead of having the highlight in the triangle, the shadows in the triangle, and almost like she has two noses here, right? This one. But once you have open shade, nice even light. So if you go back to the color temperature slide, it had a building with that diagonals, open shade. So open shade is going to be your friend, whether you are with a DSLR or with a cell phone. So I'm kind of moving in towards the lower budget or the tighter budget. If you're only shooting cell phone, you don't have any lights, you don't want to invest, you can't afford to invest, all that sort of stuff, open shade. Thankfully, the sun still shines and it's always going to be there for us. So when photographing an open shade, all the same principles of lighting, of the lighting section apply when shooting natural light. Once you found your open shade, place your artwork, and it's still recommended to use that color separation guide, but not necessary. And when you photograph 2D work, try to be as square as possible to the artwork. And it's easier with smaller artworks. We're going to see a video in a minute where I kind of run through these steps with a cell phone, and you know, the artwork's maybe about yay big. I'm able to zoom in on it with my lens. I definitely don't use that widest lens option. I either am in the middle or I zoom in a bit so I can be as square as possible, because you want to avoid any distortions. I'm going to show you how to fix distortion, but it's also more steps, more headaches, yada, yada. Also, when photographing 3D artworks, seamless background, same thing applies. It's just going to make your life easier. So before I get into that, let's talk about photographing your artworks with a cell phone. If possible, shoot raw files. Not every cell phone photo app allows this, but many do. Androids are usually ahead of the curve in terms of raw files, but I believe iPhones have finally allowed it to happen. And if you can't shoot raw directly from the iPhone native app, native camera app, you can get other apps that will allow you to shoot raw files. It's better to use your middle or zoomed in lens, not the wide angle lens, to avoid distortion. And as usual, it's a good idea to use that color separation guide if you have one. When you see, I'm going to play 2 videos in a second, or actually 3, and one of them, pardon me, 2 of them, I don't have the color separation guide. One of them I do. And you can see how to use the color correction tool in these post-production apps without the color separation guide. But the thing about the separation guide is, that's like the law. That's like a level to make sure that your picture's hanging correct. So you can kind of fudge it, but it's also the color separation guide is essentially a level to ensure that your picture is hung on the level. So if you're using a cell phone, I suggest using Snapseed as your post-production app. It's free. It's a Photoshop-like app, and it's for tablets and cell phones, and it's made by Google. Yes, you can get Photoshop Go or the Photoshop app for phones, not the program. But I think you have to pay. I'm not sure. I tend to avoid. I don't always avoid Adobe, but when I'm thinking about budget, I usually find ways to avoid Adobe, because by now the suite is so expensive. It's hard to be a working artist on a budget and use it. So Snapseed is a wonderful app for your mobile devices. Okay, first example, I'm going to play this. This is a photographing a 2D object with a cell phone. Stop me if the audio is
So you
bad.
want to photograph some of your artwork. First, you have to choose your artwork. Next, take your artwork outside. Look at the shadows. There's open shadow and there's hard light. Open shadow, hard light. Open shadow, hard light. Choose open shadow. Bingo. Next, go to your favorite photo app and then shoot zoomed in and try to get that picture as square as possible without any angles. It's difficult, but do your best. And while you're shooting, you may want to get some detail shots to accentuate your pictures. Next, go to Snapseed, which is sponsored by Google, and you can find on either iPhone or Android. When you go into Snapseed, choose Tools, choose White Balance, and pick something that's a neutral color. So you see here, I choose that white of that matte board. And now you do another choose Tools, and you choose Perspective, and do Free Perspective. So you can try to straighten out those angles as best as possible. Use the lines as a guideline to make sure that your picture is square. And then once you're satisfied, you can go back to your tools and choose Crop. And from there, you just crop in on your picture. You want to be on a free perspective. And then crop in tight to your image. Click check mark, and now you've got a beautiful picture. You hit save, you'll export it, and now you go into your camera roll. There's your picture. Ta-da! Fantastic. Thumbs up. Great picture. And that's how it's done. I hope you're well. Talk soon.
Okay, so
So you want to photograph.
just to reiterate, you see how I used the white border for the color correction instead of the concrete, or instead of the artwork itself. You want to find something neutral. Again, the color bar is more helpful, or at least more
So you
reliable.
want to photograph.
This is a 3D artwork.
So what if you want to photograph something 3D? Again, go outside. We're still looking for open shadow, not hard light. Find some open shadow and use something that can be a seamless background. Next, take pictures. After you've taken a few photographs, you choose your favorite one, and then you open it up in Snapseed.
If you guys notice, this white right here has a bluish tint to it, and this is one of the reasons why white balance is really important.
Once again, Snapseed is made by Google, and you can find it on Android and iPhone. choose your image, go to tools, choose white balance, choose the neutral zone. You see how the color changes when it's on the purple. Click the check mark, and then you go to the tools and you can adjust the brightness. You can adjust the shadows, ambience, saturation, vibrance, all that good stuff. Don't go too far. You want to make a realistic representation of your artwork. Next, export and save your image. Go back to your camera roll and you have a beautiful rendition of your artwork. Congratulations.
So that's fairly simple with if you're, this is like the simplest way to photograph your artwork. It's really just a matter of.
So what if you want to photograph something?
Minding a couple things. Okay, now photographing theater or performance work. This can be easy if you follow a few simple tricks. First of all, it helps to have your own camera. But the first most important thing is a tripod, especially in low lighting settings. I'm imagining a theater production. And it is, we talked about the camera shake, so it will be extremely beneficial for you to have a tripod at this moment. Shoot raw files if you can. Like I said before, raw files, full uncompressed files, you want that. Now, this is where the ISO asterisk comes in, because I mentioned it's a bad idea to get into like really elevated ISOs. But let's say you're photographing a theater show or play or something, and the light is low and you can't have a flash because you don't want to disrupt the show. So this is where you have to kind of hedge your ISO so that you can get to 1/60th of a second. Anything below 1/60th of a second is going to cause motion blur. So go as high as you can to get to that. I would still caution really getting into high elevated ISOs. It will cause a lot of grain, often looks very unpleasing, and is very tricky to get smoothed out in post-production. Now, this is the number 4 is very much a beginning photography conversation. Crop out everything that is unnecessary. Many people, beginners particularly, I'm going to go like this. First of all, they often are too far away, right? And they often only look at the focus without seeing all this extra space. That's not the most important thing. If I'm the subject, I'm the most important thing. So I should fill up the frame, right? If you are photographing a theater, you don't need to see a play. You don't want to see the first couple rows, before the stage. You don't want to see the stagehand to the back left, or, the props that might be getting prepared. So really crop out anything that's unnecessary. Ask yourself, what's the subject here? And if there's anything that isn't the subject that's in your picture, remove it. Either ask them to move yourself, zoom in closer, whatever you have to do. There's no reason to have this extra stuff, because that's going to be distracting. And your goal, this whole goal for these pictures is to emphasize and really accentuate the artwork that you're trying to, promote. If you're trying to get grants, if you're trying to get entered into a show, etc. So crop out anything unnecessary. If it's not involved in the subject, make sure it's out of the picture. If you're by yourself, put a stealth timer. DSLRs, full frames, cell phones all have timers. So that's another example. Put yourself on a timer. Also, if you are photographing, let's say it's a play or some theater show that, you can't be photographing during the opening or during a show. Photograph during the dress rehearsal. Communicate with whomever's the director or whomever's in charge, producer, whatnot, and then do the pictures during dress rehearsal, not during the show. And then, of course, practice. It's going to be a lot like, and I'm thinking specifically in a staged area as opposed to like performance art outside. In an area where light is dim, it's a lot like photographing a wedding at a church, no flash. So you have to elevate your ISO so your sensor is a little bit more sensitive to light. You can get a faster shutter speed and work around the event. So a dress rehearsal will be the perfect time to photograph. And then, photographing performance is basically being a photographer. So practice. Check your framing, check your ISO, check your shutter speed, and then just do the best you can. You'll get better over time. There's a lot less technical tricks than like a 2-dimensional work or a 3-dimensional work, as we've gone over before. Okay, so post-production. Now, once you've taken your pictures, that doesn't mean that you're done. And many people think, oh, you just take pictures. No, the post-production, it's like a batter. You can't hit a home run by just doing a like half check swing. You have to do the follow-through. So the follow-through is your post-production. Now, there are a number of paid and free programs. Photoshop is the standard. Lightroom Classic is a wonderful, and Adobe Bridge. And because I have access to Adobe through the school, I do use all three, and on a fairly regular basis. But my laptop at home is so old that it won't run any new Adobe programs, right? So that's one of the reasons why I use Photopea, or I use some other free. I use also Affinity Pro, which is you pay $50, you get the program for life. So I personally use those programs on my home computer because my home computer is too old to run the current Adobe brands. Again, I have my issues with Adobe, but I believe Adobe Bridge is free to everyone, and it's a fantastic tool. You can do a lot of what we're going to be doing in post-production in Adobe Bridge without having to go to Photoshop. But here's a link for Photopea. And then when processing images, you be sure to set your white balance. This is where the color separation guide comes in handy. And be sure that the right angles are fixed so that there are no distortions. And then once you've got that, you want to adjust your contrast, your saturation, and vibrancy. You want to make it look nice, but be cautious of oversaturation. For example, when I'm photographing Kathy's work, she often asks me to boost the saturation because sometimes she has these I don't know what the proper term call is, but like if you look at it one way, it's blue. If you look at it another way, it's kind of an orange or a magenta, right? So you have this kind of shark skin like appearance. And, we often have to boost up the saturation so it really stands out. And then once you've done that, crop everything out, including the color bar. And now you'll have your picture. I see there's a chat. Let me see. And I will address questions afterwards. So let's go production. As somebody who runs a gallery, this becomes a major issue. So somebody on the back end of receiving pictures from other artists. First, you need to know how to adjust your image sizes. How many DPIs? Unfortunately, all of this changes according to who has the open call. I'm going to read this example in a second. 300 DPI is the standard. But let's say, for example, I've worked with some people and I've asked them for pictures and they sent me 1200 DPI. It's like a 300 megabyte picture. Like, what are you doing? Like, I can't even open this because it's too giant. That file could be used to to print a billboard. So this is like your Simon Says moment. You want to know how to adjust your pixel width and height. You want to export your image to the proper file type and have the proper naming convention. Again, this changes per call. I wish it didn't, but each institution has their own preferences depending on what they're using to accept images. So in this example, this is one that I personally applied for maybe 2 months ago, maybe a month and a half ago. So they want your file names to be saved first name and last name, like so, last name underscore first name underscore 1. And they want it JPEGs, not PNGs, not TIFFs, not PDF, JPEGs. And the image titles are optional, but make sure that please note that your image titles are different than your file names. So the file names, Simon says file names, last name underscore first name underscore 1.jpg. That's what you have to give them. Images should be sized at a maximum of 750 pixels per inch high or 1,000 pixels per inch wide if it's a horizontal, and that they cannot exceed 2 megabytes. And then it says see entry guidelines for more details. So in the example that we're about to look at, I'm working off of this particular blurb. So here's a video where I do post-production following that particular blurb. 1 second for it to load. Any minute now. Okay, everybody, let's talk about post-production. This is a really important part. I'd like to use the analogy that this is Simon Says. So we got to be very specific, follow the directions. This particular call wants your file's name to be saved as last name underscore first name underscore 1.jpg. We'll get into that. And then we also need to make sure that our image is either 750 pixels high for a vertical or square image, or 1,000 pictures wide for a horizontal image, and they can't exceed 2 megabytes. So let's get into it. How do you do this if you don't have means? If you don't have Photoshop, you go to Photopea. I'm going to open up this image that I photographed earlier today using my cell phone and open shade. And the first thing I'm going to go to is image adjustments curves. So from here I'm going to select either this white or the gray square, and I'm going to either click in the white if I chose white. You see how it changed that white balance right there, or I'm going to choose gray and I'm going to click on the middle gray and you see that balance. So you can choose which one looks best to you. When I do the gray and then go back to the white, it seems to look pretty good. Oh, now I just ruined it. So how about this? When you ruin it like this, don't freak out. Just click on the white again. Click on the white bar. That should fix it. Reset. Well, if it doesn't, then hit reset. Anyhow, I'm going to click on the white. I'm going to click on the white, and now we have a nice balance. I'm going to click OK. Now we're going to crop this. So I'm going to hit C for crop, and I'm going to bring it down. I'm going to crop out the color bar, crop it to the borders for this moment, just for a second, and kind of give a little bit space around because we're going to want those in a second. So we'll go like this. going to hit return. At this point, I'm going to go to my layers, and I'm going to right click, and then I'm going to do duplicate layer. The reason why is I can't do a free transform on the bottom layer. So we'll get to that in a second. Now, if you don't have the rulers up like you see here, it's Command R, and you just click and drag down and put it on one of the corners. So click and drag down, click and drag over. I'm clicking from the left and I'm dragging to the right, doing it again right there. Now from here I'm still, give me a second, I like to, if I can, I usually work with the hand tool so stray tools don't go crazy. So I'm working on this top layer, right? Let me get that right bar right there. Okay, so now I'm going to do select all, Command A, and then I'm going to go to transform. Now I'm having a hard time doing this, pulling it down, getting into free transform. So what I do is I hold, I'm on a Mac, so Control Command T will open up that this transform bar, option. You see how there's anchor points around the rectangle. And I'm going to do a right click and I'm going to get to distort. That's how I'm going to use this. I'm going to grab this upper anchor and I'm going to drag it to the right so that it lines up with the blue bar. And I'm going to lift it to the top right there. And now I'm going to lift this one up a little bit, not that far, right about there, and it looks pretty good, but we'll just make a slight adjustment right there. Okay, now I'm going to hit enter, and I'm going to come back to here and I'm going to merge layers. So the front should be our main image. Come on now, do your business. See if I can flatten it. Alright, so we're still going to cut that out anyhow. So I'm going to go to crop mode, and now I'm going to crop it down to the image itself. I'm cropping out those borders right there and right there. I may nitpick a little bit. I can see that it's slightly off, but you know, you get the drift. I'm going to be just like that. I'm going to hit enter, and we're pretty good. Again, I get a little nitpicky at times, so I will just finely trim that white part out right there, and then again right there, this top left. So there you go, there you go. Not too hard. Photo P is pretty easy. It's kind of slow, but otherwise it's pretty easy. The point is, here we go. Now we got our picture square. The white balance looks good. It's just a really handsome image right now. Okay, so now I'm going to go to oh, pardon me. We didn't talk about image size. So we go to image size, and that this call right here says 1,000 pixels wide. So I'm going to go here, and here is our width. I'm going to type in 1,000. I see that's pixels. So long as that's linked right there, it's just going to automatically stick to the proportions. And then I'm going to hit OK, and then there's your picture. Now again, this crop tool is bothering me, so I'm just going to move it out of the way. Okay, so that's how we get to change the image size, right? If you ever see anything like this, 750 pixels, 1000 pixels, you have to get into the image size to fix it. Okay, now I'm going to export it as JPEG and 1000 wide. That's what we're looking for. I'm going to do 100%. I wouldn't go below 60, but I'm going to do 100% because I know that it's not going to be over 2 megabytes. You can see right here that it's not going to be. So I'm going to hit save. And then this is where the Simon Says moment is. You want last name. This is my last name, underscore first name, underscore 1. And I'm going to put another underscore because you can see I've done this before. And that's how you download it. And then there's your picture, looking beautiful, looking square, got good white balance, and if you look right here, under 2 megabytes. And now you are, I'll delete these so I can put it like that, and now you're ready to upload or submit your image. Now, of course, it's very important that you follow the Simon Says directions and be aware that they change with each open call. Okay, and with that, I end my my workshop. I will take any questions.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Great information. Yeah, yeah. Hopefully, some folks will ask some questions. But I do have maybe I can add a couple, and I don't know if maybe there's some things that we can follow up on as we post stuff to our website. The information that you've given us, the PDF, this documentation would be great. I don't know. Maybe the question of camera suggestions came up. I don't know if there's 2 or 3 that we could maybe suggest down the road, maybe from your phone to you were talking about micro four thirds a bit, just some DSLR. I don't know if there's something that you might be able to say, look, these are really great budget cameras. I think the idea of the 50 millimeter lens was a great suggestion as well. I don't know, something like that. Also, you talked about the photo tents and the booths, right, which are kind of ubiquitous all over Amazon.
Yeah.
Maybe something like that. We could add some suggestions.
Yeah.
For those photo booths. And that's kind of a couple of things that caught my mind as you were talking through. I knew that there were. Yeah.
I don't own a single photo tent.
Right.
Because I know how to make them, like out of my own stuff. And because I've also run into oh, this photo tent's perfect for my ring, but not good for my bottle.
Correct.
But again, I have the privilege and the ability to kind of maneuver that.
Absolutely.
But I will definitely be happy to find some, some links just for people to look at. For the camera, I mean, the shortest answers are like Canon T7 or T8, whatever's the latest. But you're really never going to get me to find or to say which is the best camera.
Yeah.
Because it's just simply not a real answerable question.
All right. Okay. Yeah. There's a couple other questions here in chat. On the color separation guide, you take the photo with that next to the image.
Yes.
I don't know if you want to answer that.
Yes, you put it next to the image. You want it to be, excuse me, you want it to have as close of the same light as you possibly can with your object. Paint soft pastel watercolors, texture of the background, white watercolor paper is harsh, showing shadows. Is it because of the dimension of the paper? And most likely you're having directional light crossing the texture of the paper, and that's what I'm imagining causing any shadow. Back to open shade, your friend.
Yeah, I will tell you, I was a bit surprised by the open shade, right?
Yeah.
I know that I have shot a lot of the stuff, in a pinch, throw it out on the patio, and I'll go usually to direct light.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
But it makes more sense in the open shade thing, and then adjusting the white, because that's what it is. You have to adjust the white balance after you've shot it.
yeah,
So, but
yeah,
that was really helpful.
yeah. No, I know. Because so for instance, I teach a lot of photo classes out here, and where I'm at, it's hot sun everywhere, just like blazing hot sun. And I always think to myself, like, y'all need to use a diffuser. And if you're not going to actually stand there with the diffuser, go to the open shade, because that's the beauty, the real beauty's in the open shade.
Right. Is there anything else? Before we had this this webinar today, we talked about Snapseed and Snap-P, and Snapseed could really be helpful for a lot of people, I think.
Yeah.
I didn't even know about that software. It's kind of free and open source, so that's really kind of a wonderful thing. And it's also on mobile as well.
The Snapseed can be on your phone, Android, laptop, not laptop, but your tablets and phones.
Right. Okay. So it's an iOS, right, kind of a deal, or
or Android. Yeah.
Or Android. Right.
Yeah.
All right.
And Photopea is online.
And Photopea is online, right?
Yeah, just like .com, and
right.
You just have to suffer through all the ads on the right side.
Right.
We'll share links for those when we put out the PDFs.
Yeah.
For folks as well.
You're welcome, Joanna. Are there any other questions? I know we're scheduled to end in 2 minutes.
No. Well,
yeah, and if anybody has any kind of follow-up questions, that was a lot of information, right? I think that was a lot. It's you really don't realize, especially when you were touching on post-production. And I see a lot of people when they're trying to submit photos for like our fellowship, trying to make sure they have the highest resolution, and the DPI stuff, right? That can be a little complicated.
Yeah.
And keeping the file size to a manageable file size for 40 megabytes.
It drives me bananas when we do open calls for our gallery. Yeah.
So I think that was helpful. So we'll see.
Great.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for attending. And just keep an eye out on our social media and our email list as to when the recorded webinar and additional material will be posted.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody, for showing up. Andrew, thank you so much again for your time, and we'll follow up.
Yeah.
Great. I look forward to hearing from you all. Thank you, Massimo from Italy. Thank you for everybody who joined us. And thank you for your time. Thank you, Sapira. Thank you.